Good evening, everyone. My name is Candace, and I'm an event manager at Town Hall. On behalf of the rest of the staff at Town Hall, Grist, and our friends at Third Place Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation with Dana Bourland and Clayton Aldern as part of our science series. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person yet. I'd like to thank Dana and Clayton for appearing tonight to help make that possible. If you share in Town Hall's vision for a robust community engaged in the arts, science, and culture where everyone has a voice, please consider supporting us tonight by donating or becoming a member. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. We will be taking a bit of a break through the summer, but for the rest of June, we have some good programs coming up. A few of those include the 100th episode of our in-house podcast, In the Moment, comes out tomorrow, with Town Hall staff as guests recalling the past year's ups and downs. Pulitzer Prize winner Professor Annette Gordon-Reed discusses her new book on Juneteenth and offers us a new framework to understand the complex history of the Lone Star State. And Sasha Eisenberg and Aditi Roy join us to chronicle the 25-year struggle over marriage equality in America. You can check out more of what's upcoming by visiting our online calendar at townhallseattle.org. Tonight's presentation is going to be about 60 minutes, including Q&A. Questions will be selected from those in the chat field at the bottom of the video player, so you can submit those at any time. You can also text questions to 206-504-2857 as noted in the chat. We can't guarantee that we will be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, you can click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The program will be available for rewatching immediately following the event. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Matulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, the Northcliffe Foundation, Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington. And finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I want to thank the members watching tonight. Lastly, you will want to dive deeper into this evening's topic by purchasing a copy of the book being presented. Please use the link in the chat to purchase through Third Place Books, who's our partner tonight. And now for this evening's program. Dana Bourland works at the intersection of issues related to health, poverty, and the environment. She led the creation of the Environment Program at the JPB Foundation, and before that was Vice President of the Green Initiatives for Enterprise Community Partners, where she oversaw all aspects of Enterprise's award-winning Green Communities program, including the creation of the Green Communities criteria and Enterprise's multifamily retrofit program. She is featured in and has contributed to numerous publications, including the books Apollo's Fire, Igniting America's Clean Energy Economy, published in 2007, Growing Greener Cities, published in 2008, Greening Our Built World, Costs, Benefits, and Strategies from 2010, and Becoming an Urban Planner, which was also published in 2010. Clayton Aldern is a data reporter at Grist, a Rhodes Scholar and a Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow. His writing and data visualization have appeared in The Atlantic, The Economist, The Guardian, Vox, and many other publications. Previously, he led data analysis and program evaluation and the program evaluation team for homelessness programs in Pierce County, right here in Washington State. Aldern is also a research affiliate of the University of Washington's Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. And with Greg Colburn, he is the author of the forthcoming book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem. Tonight, though, they'll be discussing Bourland's new book, Gray to Green Communities, A Call to Action on the Housing and Climate Crisis. Please join me in welcoming Clayton Aldern and Dana Bourland.
Thank you. Thanks, Candace. Thanks to Town Hall, and thank you, Dana, not only for being here, but for writing this book. I'm actually not coming to you live from Seattle. I would perhaps be from the Bullitt Center, where Grist is HQ'd, and we might talk about that building later tonight. I'm currently home in Minnesota, so I'm personally on Oshetisakowan land, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and I bring this up not to only acknowledge the territorial lands on which I'm currently located, but also to think a little bit about the Minnesota context currently, in which water protectors are protesting the Line 3 pipeline development. And I want to maybe spend a little bit of time connecting some of these conversations later on. Before we do that, I was hoping to just open the conversation by thinking about the title of this book, right? Gray to Green Communities. It's a really interdisciplinary text for a broad audience. But I suspect most folks in this audience, they might be perhaps more familiar with one domain of research and not necessarily the other. So Dana, I'm wondering if you could begin by just connecting the dots for us, right? You write that our housing stock is out of sync with our climate goals. What does that mean?
Yeah, terrific. Love to start there, Clayton. Thank you so much. And to the Town Hall Seattle for hosting us tonight. What a great opportunity. And I appreciate opening with this question. Yeah, our housing stock is definitely out of sync with a lot of things, and in particular, our climate goals. And, I guess it's important to say, although probably most of the listeners already know it, but it's worth repeating, that we're really at this extraordinary point in our human history, that the people who had the least to do with our housing and climate crises are the ones who on a daily basis are bearing the brunt of its impact. And it's really traumatic, from day to day. You just don't know when that rug's going to get pulled out from under your feet. And as you note, the way I think about it is that how we're producing and preserving our housing in this country is just not keeping up with demand. And it is definitely at odds with what we need to do to curb carbon emissions to avoid even worse sort of catastrophic planetary collapse. And I think it's worth repeating also, and this might not be as common of a fact, but 20% of our carbon emissions in the United States come from the way that we are heating, cooling, and powering our homes. And so it makes our homes the world's 6th largest emitter of carbon emissions, sort of putting us on par with countries like Brazil. And I think that's worth thinking about for a moment, that our homes, these important places for our health and well-being, are the way we are building and operating them are contributing to this severe crisis that we're faced with in terms of climate chaos. And, we're often looking at ways to sort of have a quick fix, have technology solve this for us. We hear a lot about decarbonizing the electric grid, but quite frankly, even if we were to do that, we would still have a problem in terms of our homes, because over half of all of our housing in this country is at least 40 years old. So everybody living in those homes would continue to be emitting carbon emissions unless we intervene. And this is important to say, because it's not just about averting these massive climate events that we can't afford to continue paying to rebuild from, but we're also locking people into homes that are completely unprepared for climate impacts. And the people living in those homes are paying extraordinary amounts for their monthly utility bills. And when I say people, Clayton, I'm really talking about people who are already having to choose between whether or not they can pay their rent or put food on the table, or their mortgage or medicine, or even having fun. I know a woman in North Carolina that calls it eating cheap while it's electric bill week. So these are real sort of daily choices that people are having to make because our housing is just so out of sync with both our climate goals, but just what people need to be able to live and thrive in this day and age.
Sure. So it seems like there's an energy justice conversation to be had here, and an environmental justice conversation to be had here, which isn't necessarily where the housing policy debate often pivots. So I spend my waking hours working for Grist, which is a climate and environmental justice magazine. This intersection, makes a lot of sense to me as someone who thinks a lot about this stuff. But as you kind of go through this punch list of why these two crises are intertwined, I'm kind of almost by necessity forced to ask what's the other side of the coin, right? Just so we can kind of get out in front of it. What is green housing? Why do we need it? Candace mentioned the green communities criteria in your bio. What is that? What's your quick fix? Just give it to us now, even if it's not so quick.
Well, the way I think about it is that gray housing connotes this sort of practice that may benefit a few in the short term, but it negatively impacts all of us and our planet over the long haul. Whereas green housing connotes these practices that benefit all of us while supporting the health of our planet now and for the long time to come. And so, that's really how I think about it. It's quite clear we're either engaged in this sort of green way of thinking, or we're contributing to locking us into an old way of thinking that we can't afford anymore. And so that is exactly why I was thrilled to be a part of this national initiative called the Green Communities Initiative to rethink the way that we're delivering housing in this country. And we developed green communities criteria, which are being used by over 27 housing finance agencies in this country. They're the basis of Fannie Mae's green lending program. So they've been tested and tried and are true, I guess. But the way that I like to think about it is it's a way of thinking. So the green communities criteria aren't just a checklist that you do once and put down and that's it. But it ignites this way of thinking about these massive challenges in front of us. How do we house everybody affordably, regardless of their race or income? How do we actually curb carbon emissions? And so the green communities criteria are just a holistic way of thinking about that.
Sure. I found in my reading of the book, which is great, and again, speaks to a lot of the intersections that I find myself thinking about a lot. I found that there was what almost felt like a disproportionate focus on health outcomes, right? And it seems to me that part of the green communities criteria, if I'm interpreting them correctly, is to ensure that we are indeed taking a more integrative approach, that we are indeed thinking about kind of whole personhood and whole communityhood. And that would seem to include health outcomes. So certainly there's a fiscal conversation to be had here. But I'm wondering, it seems to me that these community health outcomes often kind of acted as proxies for whether we're headed in the right direction, if we're meeting these crises head on. So is that a fair reading? I mean, what is the importance of community health in this text for you?
Yeah, it's a really fair reading, Clayton. Thanks for picking up on that, because I think the main point I want to make is that we can build in a green way of thinking affordably at no additional cost to do some of these basic measures that are going to improve the economics and the environmental benefits. But you're right, these co-benefits are ones of health. And the point I like to make in the book is that we're connected. And we've really learned this over the past year and a half, that your health depends on my health and well-being depends on yours. And you can take that to the community scale, that we are interconnected. And so when we engage in a green way of thinking, when we start applying a green lens, then we have these additional benefits. We can certainly meet our housing and climate crisis and enjoy these greater health benefits. And, going back, I think, to the recognition that you're on occupied land, I'm sitting here on Lenape land, that if we go to the root cause of why we're even having to address such enormous crises, a lot of it has to do with colonialism, with white supremacy, with racist land use practices that aren't just historic, but have continued to today. And some of the things we just really have to address are that, as I mentioned, so much of our housing stock already exists. Even though we need to continue building new affordable housing, there are still over 500,000 people living in housing that expose them to lead paint. And we hear a lot about lead in the water, but we're not hearing still as much about the need to remedy something as basic as lead paint exposure. And so I say that because once we start thinking about delivering housing differently and applying a green lens to it, we can address so many other issues all at once, sort of in one fell swoop, as I like to say, that can reduce our carbon emissions, can improve our health and well-being, and can do it in a way that's affordable so that everybody can have a home regardless of their race or income.
So we're talking a lot about green housing per se, right? We make these great changes to the housing stock, okay, sign me up. But this isn't just a book, or I imagine a conversation we're having now about building per se, right? And I think, in fact, it's not the title of the book. The title of the book is Gray to Green Communities. So just, to think about that word a little bit, what is it about a green community per se that's so important? What do we get from that word that we're not getting from green building or green housing?
Yeah, I appreciate that question, Clayton, because often we think about green building as sort of a noun, an end product, but really it's a way of thinking, as I've said, and it's a verb. It's so much more than just the end product. And, in the book, I talk about an example of a woman I met named Tracy in Austin. And I met her as she just moved into this fabulous new development. And she was thrilled because she's a nursing student and she could finally afford her rent. But over time, she started realizing that there were these other benefits. So she could afford her rent because it was actually designed to meet the green communities criteria. It was incredibly energy and water efficient. It was smartly located in a place where she could hop on a bus and get to school, but also it was done in a way that used healthy materials. So her son wasn't waking up in the middle of the night with triggers related to asthma, but he was sleeping through the night. She was able to study. And, it was affordable. And that is exactly why she moved there. And I was talking to her in her home. And when I walked out of her apartment building, I walked straight into sort of a green space of trees. And there was a wetland and there was a way to walk around here. It was beautiful. And that's what I mean by it's more than just how we're building. This community in this part of Austin, it had been a dumping ground for Austin's appliances and, who knows what. And they took control of that land and decided they wanted to have housing that could be permanently affordable and then preserve the rest of the land to become a flourishing green space. And, I think what we have to do is stop thinking about just green building as simply energy efficiency, but more this way of thinking about where are products coming from? Where will they go after this home, is redeveloped? We can't afford to have dumping grounds that are in communities where people still live and are impacted then by those negative surrounds. But we also can't have green housing at the expense of making other communities gray because we're extracting and producing materials for our homes that are creating both carbon emissions, but also polluting the air around those facilities that get into our homes and into our schools. So it becomes this whole way of thinking that enables our communities to flourish and thrive. And instead of just thinking about simply producing a unit of housing and with disregard for everything else that's going to be impacted by doing that.
Mm-hmm. You've got this great Bob Bullard quote in the book about how there's no zoning in Houston, but basically communities of color are de facto zoned as like compatible use for pollution, right?
Yeah.
And so I think about a coal plant, for example. It's not housing, but it does define community and health outcomes. What does the green communities criteria, or indeed this movement writ large. What does the criteria have to say about something like a coal plant? You can't. You're not talking about building them, obviously, but are you talking about tearing them down? What's the relationship between these kind of like energy policy and planning conversations and some of the more micro level discussions that you just brought up?
Yeah, I think for me, it's that if we engage in this better way of thinking, this green way of thinking, we can actually address racial justice, economic justice, and environmental justice. And so what you're calling out from the book is exactly right. 6 million people living within 3 miles of a coal-fired plant only make $18,000 a year. So that sort of exemplifies, I think, what you just said, that we have these coal-fired plants that are zoned as compatible uses for polluting, majority Black, Indigenous, and persons of color communities. So the Green Communities Initiative is about thinking about how all of this fits together. I mean, you're in Minnesota right now with the Line 3 protests to stop what could be one of the largest oil pipelines. And we have to see ourselves as connected to that issue. I oftentimes, am fixated on solving our housing and climate crisis and really fixated on housing, and don't always see those connections, which now I can't unsee, that the way we're producing our housing, the way we're operating our housing is still calling for us to have this obsolete fossil fuel dependent infrastructure. We need to be showing up with our brothers and sisters on the front lines of Line 3, protecting our water, because we all benefit. We all benefit when we transition from this gray sort of infrastructure to green infrastructure. We all benefit from clean air, clean water, clean soil. And so I think, I know that the Green Communities Initiative is about linking these ways of thinking together, because we are interconnected, and your health, as I said, depends on my health and vice versa.
Thanks. This has come up a couple of times, and for folks, with less context, again, I'm in Minnesota right now, just south of these Line 3 pipeline protests. Anishinaabe, Ojibwe water protectors are, basically calling everyone to the shores of the Mississippi right now. It's kind of the Mississippi headwaters area. And they've occupied and camped directly on the proposed drill site for Line 3, holding ceremony, protecting treaty rights, basically, kind of as Native and non-Native participants and treaty partners. I'm curious, so kind of given that context and what you just said, Dana, I'm curious, where does land sovereignty and treaty rights, how do they enter the equation for you? And how does land sovereignty and tribal sovereignty, how does this idea help us make sense of the housing and climate crises?
Yeah, and I want to come back to that last piece too, because I wanted to mention that, let's say the water permits are issued and the pipeline gets built. Even if we transition off fossil fuels, those companies are going to be looking for places to put their petrochemicals. And right now, and if they're successful into the future, they will continue putting those byproducts and feedstocks into our building materials. And that production process will add to the pollution of our communities as well as to carbon emissions. So that's another connection I want to maybe come back to, Clayton, is our building materials. But yeah, I mean, look, I think in the first, couple pages of the book, I address land sovereignty, because to me, that's where we should be starting. The importance of recognizing land sovereignty is that communities must have effective access to, control over, and use of their land. And I come from a profession of housing and community development that has a history of forgetting that, and has a history of using our housing and land use policies to segregate and to, quite frankly, marginalize whole communities and races. And so I call for, first and foremost, recognizing that principle as sort of our guiding light, that land sovereignty is where we have to start. We have to recognize the history of our land, the people of those communities, and make sure that they're in positions where they can direct their future and design it in a way that they want to live into it. And we are here in support of that. And, you know, to me, that's just sort of a primary principle of the gray to green transition.
Sure. I think it, what you just said reminds me, I can't quite recall the section in the text, but you spend a lot of time talking about effectively grassroots policy design, right? And like bottom up informing of a given decision-making process. You'd mentioned just briefly building materials a minute ago, and I'm wondering if we can connect these ideas a little more. What am I supposed to do if I don't want formaldehyde in my home, or some, you know, I'm wondering how the community engagement conversation might be, or even can be, related to the building materials conversation, which just feels really hard and icky, and I don't know anything about it. If I'm a homeowner, and maybe I even know less about it as a renter because I don't know what my building is made of. What can I do?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I hope I have a good answer for you. I mean, first and foremost, we need to be asking questions. You know, we do that when we buy food, or at least, you know, I think a majority of us now, and all of us, have access to food that has food labels on it. And so collectively, we need to be calling for the same thing about our consumer products, and I would say about our building products. They have such a tremendous impact on us, particularly in this past year where we spent so much time indoors. But even without a pandemic, we spend, you know, 80–90% of our time indoors. And we are not asking before we purchase what those products are going to do to us. And the companies are polluting us without our permission. And they are putting chemicals, whole classes of chemicals, into our products in ways that we're completely ill-informed about. So I would say the least you could do before you buy anything is maybe look it up, Google it, or ask the place where you're purchasing it from, you know, are there known classes of toxic chemicals? There's a great site called the Healthy Building Network you could go to with just a plethora of resources about the kind of products you could just stop buying and avoid altogether. So I think we have to, just as a collective, get more informed about what we're exposing ourselves to. As I noted in the book, I wore sort of the silicone bracelet for a week or two that was part of a research study about what chemicals are we being exposed to in our home. And I thought I'd do pretty well. You know, I was living in a US Green Building Council certified building, and I live a pretty organic life, but I still had exposure to bioaccumulative toxic chemicals. And that's as scary as it sounds. These chemicals, you know, don't leave our bodies. So, you know, we need to start asking what's in them, but also collectively demanding that manufacturers tell us and put labels on them, because it's not just for our health, it's for the workers' health too, who are building our homes and being exposed to these products.
So thank you for that. I'm almost not even sure how to ask this next question, which is basically, you know, okay, I'm sold. I'm interested in simultaneously solving both our housing and climate crises. Sign me up. I am responding to your call to action. But I've read the book, and being convinced by both the logic and the case studies and the fiscal argument, right? You make a point of detailing how you know, a lot of communities that correspond to or check the non-boxes of the Green Communities initiative, or criteria rather, you know, they pay for themselves in like utility savings alone over you know, a given time horizon. So this is to say nothing of the health outcomes, to say nothing of the environmental outcomes. On kind of purely economic terms, basically, if you do what these criteria say, utility costs alone are going to go down enough such that they're going to offset the additional construction costs. Okay, so my question is, why don't we see more housing like this? Like, what's the problem? And in particular, I guess I'm wondering if you see the kind of grand challenges here as purely political or social in nature, or if there is a really strong fiscal argument that kind of rears its ugly head in response to even your numbers. What's preventing us from building more green communities?
Yeah, great question. And it's sort of everything you said is part of the reason why we're not asking for it. There's not a collective public will saying this is the kind of development we want in our community. So that's a huge problem. We're not asking for it, and typically we only get what we ask for. So developers who even mean really well are going to keep doing what they know how to do. There's no risk involved. They know how to finance it. They know how to get it approved. They can use their existing professional team. When you start thinking about doing your business differently, there's a lot to learn. And sometimes that means working with different people. Sometimes that means kind of reorienting your framework. So if we're not asking for it, then unless someone is sort of on the leading edge and really doing their homework, they're probably just going to keep providing sort of more conventionally gray housing. So there's that aspect of it. And then for the developers who really get it and want to do more of this, it's sometimes difficult to find the right team, particularly with our existing housing stock. We need and must train an entire new sector of contractors who understand how to holistically improve existing housing. What I'm afraid of as we see, billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, which we've never seen in my lifetime, devoted to housing. I'm afraid if we don't learn how to braid all of this housing funding and financing coming from the federal government, then we're just going to get more conventional housing. So we have to match the funding that's available for weatherization with the funding that's available to remove lead paint, with the funding that's available to construct and preserve housing. It's complicated, And so I think that's a lot of why we're not getting this by right. And we need to continue putting public pressure so that we can figure it out and that we can encourage and support the development community and the finance community and the design community to do things in this new way.
So it seems like part of what you're saying is we need to be a little more creative with our housing policies and a little more intentional with marrying some of these tools together. What about on the kind of climate policy side of the coin? I mean, you write that offsets are, I think you use the phrase like a dangerous panacea or something, which I love. How do we become more intentional and creative with our climate policies? Why aren't offsets good enough?
Yeah, I mean, we just don't see housing as part of the climate solution. It's one of the reasons why I finished this book. So I started writing this book in 2012, really as a way to say thank you to everybody that was involved in thinking differently about the way that they were delivering housing in this country. And I put it down. I got busy with other things. And in the last couple of years, I decided I have to tell this story because as an environmental, sort of philanthropist working for a private foundation, I was seeing climate actions and then I was seeing housing action and I wasn't seeing them happening together. And as I said in the beginning of our time together tonight, they are inextricably connected. We cannot meet our housing goals without also meeting our climate goals. And so I may be getting off track here with my answer, but climate change, it's really climate chaos, is sort of how we're talking about these days because of its unpredictability of impact. But what we're trying to solve for are these sort of more technological fixes or energy system fixes rather than the root cause of what got us here. And when we address the root cause, that's when we see things in terms of needing to develop our housing differently, needing to produce different materials, needing to make sure that 500,000 people who have no home are housed so that they're not weathering the pandemics and the big weather events on the streets or in some makeshift dwellings. So for me, these two things are just inextricably connected, but I'm often seeing climate action talked about only in terms of fossil fuel infrastructure and big technological fixes. And I'm not seeing it as needing to develop our housing differently. And so that's, I think, a big disconnect.
Where did that disconnect come from? I mean, why don't you think these conversations are happening in tandem to the extent that perhaps they should? And maybe this is in part a question about process in writing the book. I mean, okay, climate change, environmental justice, energy justice, housing, homelessness, treaty rights. We just spoke a bit about climate action and I mean, I think there's like a branding and communications conversation to be had, like what constitutes greenwashing, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot happening in this book, and it's, you know, what, 200 pages? So you cover a lot of ground very quickly. And I know you've had to be, you know, pretty judicious in choosing which cases to highlight, which data to highlight. How can you share a little more about your process, like why you've chosen the cases you have? And again, you know, the original part of my question was, where did this disconnect come from? Why aren't we having these conversations in tandem? And why have you chosen the pieces you have to start to help bridge that gap?
Yeah, you know, I feel like I was part of the problem, right? So when I helped develop the Green Communities criteria and really helped launch the Green Communities initiative, I was reticent to talk about climate change, even though I knew that the way that we were asking housing to be developed to meet the Green Communities criteria was going to lower carbon emissions because we would be demanding less electricity and we'd have different building practices and different locations for our homes that would have transportation emissions impacts. I knew all that, but I didn't lead with the fact that this was a strong climate action. I led with, let's meet our housing affordability crisis. Because those of us who predominantly work on housing, we know that there's so much to be done and that we have to do it in a way where we're really thinking about the bottom line. And we can't engage in green building practices at the expense of meeting the number of homes that we need to both preserve affordably and build affordably. But you know what, Clayton, I mean, the reason I finished the book, as I said, is that that's the wrong mindset. We have to do both at the same time. And so I think the disconnect comes from thinking that we have to address housing as a housing issue, and we have to address climate as a climate issue with sort of, you know, technology or infrastructure or something. And we're not seeing housing as part of that. When it is, housing is infrastructure. It's a basic human right. And it's part of the fabric of this country. It's our basic infrastructure. And so we can't keep developing it conventionally using gray practices. And, you know, yeah, it's a rather short book. And I was a little stingy with some of the examples because I didn't want to make it about personal examples. I tell some of my personal stories, but I didn't want to make it all about individual stories of, you know, sort of why this made a person's life better or how it allowed a person to address climate change in their community, because these are systemic issues. And so I tried to focus on data and examples that would get at sort of these systemic issues that we need to address.
And as somebody who tries to get their grubby mitts on this data all the time and play with it, I know firsthand it's not particularly easy, right? I mean, there's tons of climate data out there in the world, but it's not always the easiest to wrap one's head around. These are often huge data sets. And housing policy and building data are all over the place. The data sets are a little bit smaller, but I would argue they're often exceptionally siloed. So how did you go about answering your data questions? Like this seems to me to be kind of a difficult set of fields to bridge in terms of asking quantitative questions of your thesis. How'd you go about any of that work?
Yeah, I could have used you. I wish I knew you while I was doing my research, because you're right. I mean, I had to go to one site for homeownership data, one site for rental data, one site for some kind of climate data. You know, at the end of the day, we have a massive housing affordability issue in this country. And whether it's 11 million people who can't afford housing or 7.2 really low income people who can't afford housing, most of this country has an issue when it comes to affording the kind of housing that they want to live in the communities where they want to be in, to live the kind of life that they envision for themselves. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I became obsessed initially at getting the numbers right. But then I realized it actually doesn't matter. It does matter when it comes to each state and city and locale forecasting and, you know, really getting a handle on the issue. But generally speaking, we have a massive issue to address both the housing and climate crises. And so we just need to get to work here, and we need to do these things together, because we can't afford them as separate issues. We have to address them together. And so while the data is frustrating, and honestly, I would love to see kind of a federal homepage that could help us track this better. But to do that, we have to make a national commitment that this is indeed something we care about, and that we will be tracking and be accountable to everybody who is looking for a home that they can afford in the community where they want to be living in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, I think that's right. The numbers matter for a given parcel, or indeed perhaps a given municipality. But as far as a call to action goes, like any 8-figure number should compel you, both morally and economically, right? A number that large should say something, irrespective of the individual digits.
Totally. You know, 500,000 people at least that has been exacerbated because of the pandemic, who do not even have a home that they can afford. I mean, yes, I couldn't agree more. We just need to get busy and meet this challenge.
So in our last 15 minutes or so here, I want to make sure I open some of this discussion up to the audience. I've had some questions flowing in, and I think this one that I'm about to read is a nice segue here, thinking about this really integrative approach. Are you familiar with the 15-minute neighborhood?
Yes.
So the question is basically, do you think this is realistic? And if so, does something like the 15-minute neighborhood have a natural relationship with something like the green communities criterion, or are these kind of orthogonal to one another? I mean, in part, this is a question about walkability, but that notion in particular, what does it say to you? And is it something we want?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. If it's something we want, again, it gets back to this issue of land sovereignty. So where are we talking about implementing this? Does the community want it? Have they been able to have a discussion about it? From my opinion, I love the idea. I just really appreciate local communities, neighborhood scale solutions. I spent a lot of time thinking about how we all should have a 10-minute walk to a park, and trying to enable cities and communities to realize that it's true for so many things. I mean, I have the great fortune of living in New York during the pandemic. I could walk, to my basic needs. That's not true for all communities, and not everybody wants to live in New York. And that's a question we get a lot, around density. And it's not just about building a lot of housing altogether. The idea of a 15-minute community is that you have access to these amenities and basic needs and sort of building blocks of communities within reasonable distance of each other, so that we're getting our needs met as a community in our community.
So another question here that I think is a great follow-on, and it's a little spicy, so I hope you're ready to enter
Yes.
controversy land.
Okay.
In Seattle in particular, and in a lot of cities around the country, but one of the questions that's continuing to pop up in Seattle and over again recently is around zoning and cost to build, and what it would mean to densify the city. So often there's a proposal on the table, whether from an advocate or a policymaker. Minneapolis has approached this question, for example, basically get rid of the areas or flip over the areas or somehow constrain the areas that are zoned solely for single family housing. And I'm wondering if you have a perspective on single family housing and in particular that zoning designation and the conversation that's revolving around it, and how that conversation might relate to green communities.
Yeah, I think it directly relates to green communities, and it becomes local. And this is also getting at the root cause of why are communities the way they are today. What was it about, whether it was the FHA only lending money to developers that would sell them or lease them to white households, or our cities like Minneapolis didn't become the way they were overnight. They are the product of racist housing policies and practices over time. And it's not just housing practice, it's school development practice, it's transportation practice. And so, we absolutely need to figure out how to untangle that and get at the root cause to enable the kind of land use zoning and practices that are going to heal our communities and are going to repair our communities and are going to allow us to be living together in ways that we want to be. So it's very much intertwined with the direction that the green communities criteria and just a green way of thinking is trying to lead us into.
And does your answer change if we're talking about condos or skyscraper buildings kind of versus single family homes, just in terms of kind of greening these units? This is an audience question, right? What are some of the differences between the factors that go into these larger buildings versus smaller parcels or indeed smaller buildings?
Yeah. If you're talking about from sort of an energy perspective, or even just the material usage and the water usage that go into the different types of, whether it's a high rise, mid rise, or townhome or a single family, they definitely have different impacts on the environment, but they don't have to have the extreme difference in impacts that they often do. We can have single family homes that are built really well and have a light impact on the environment and can remain affordable, just as we can have high rises that do the same thing. So I don't think that we should get caught up in thinking there's only one housing solution. If we want to be super green and efficient, we have to only build sky rises. That's not a way I would encourage us to think. So I think there could be a continuum of housing choices that are offered depending on what the community needs and wants. And we're missing, a lot of different types of homes. We're not building homes necessarily that meet the needs of large families or communal families. We're not designing homes that allow us, to be able to have the back, a small unit that maybe are another family member or that we could rent out. There are a lot of different ways that we could be developing housing. And for many reasons, we've gotten to a place often where we feel like we only have one or two choices, and that's all we're delivering. And we're delivering it over and over and over again. And from an ecological standpoint, we know that that's not a healthy way of doing anything. Ecosystems are diverse and, have complex systems, and that's how our communities need to be.
So that's a perfect segue to another audience question here, and this is kind of on the zanier end of the housing ecosystem, right? The new stuff. What do you think about the advent of like green 3D printed houses, for example? Are there any new technologies that feel they're really fit for purpose in realizing this vision, or can we make it work with what we have?
We could make it work with what we have. I think we could make it work better with what we could have. I think I would always be a proponent of trying new things, not necessarily experimenting on affordable housing, but let's see, where can we go? Where can we push and think differently? I'm here in my home. My husband has a 3D printer. I love the idea of, possibly using that technology to meet our housing demand. But again, we have to think about, well, what would be the ingredients of the materials that we would be printing with? Is that what the community needs? How can it be designed in a way that the community feels fits into the historical and cultural fabric of that neighborhood? So I'm all for, better ways of developing. That's what's so exciting about green communities, is that it ignites our imagination and allows us to think that we can do things differently. And I'm a big fan of, looking at technologies that are already being used in other countries, applying them here. Certainly we're seeing way more passive house development, which is terrific. I would love us to think about, how do we do more homes in one sort of attempt at greening them, not house by house, but are there some solutions that allow us to do this at a much greater scale? Because I feel like that is an obstacle we haven't really found a solution to. We're still operating sort of building by building. Is there something we could do that would allow us to do many more homes and buildings at once?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think somewhere in the book, there's this great table that basically illustrates how the green communities criterion is kind of the only national scope green building criterion that is specific to affordable housing. And that seems really worth highlighting here, given what you just said. This is a conversation about communities, but in particular, it's about affordable communities. And I am wondering, how does any of what you just said change as a function of where you are in the country? And the reason I ask is because I'm reflecting on some of my own work, which kind of seeks to establish the causal factors that drive variation in housing stability in different communities and housing instability indeed. And kind of lo and behold, it appears to be the case that these housing markets are awfully contextually dependent. And a whole lot of predictive power in thinking about housing instability and homelessness just comes from looking at the housing market, which I think would also suggest that because of that contextual dependence, a lot of what you're arguing for is going to necessarily need to be remapped as a function of geography. So fair question, unfair question. How do you think about the fact that this is a national criteria, for example, and a national set of questions in scope, but these visions need to be realized locally in different markets?
Yeah, totally fair question. And I remember getting a lot of pushback for the green communities criteria in the beginning, because what we wanted was a holistic way of thinking about greening affordable housing in this country that could be applied across the country, whether you were on tribal lands, if you were in rural communities, if you were in suburban, urban, wherever you were, whatever kind of housing you were building, that you could meet the green communities criteria. So that's what we're talking about when I talk about the green communities criteria. It is a holistic framework for our entire housing system. And so, in the beginning, what it allowed us to do was create a baseline. So we could think about housing that was going to be delivering these health and economic and environmental benefits, no matter what you were building or where you were building. And so even in a place at the time, let's say Portland, Oregon, we felt like, oh, they're already advanced. They're already doing a lot of green building back in 2004 and 5. But actually they weren't thinking about the materials. Or in a place, another state, perhaps they were advanced in thinking about water conservation, but they weren't thinking about location, or, it's uneven. The playing field is very uneven. And what we're trying to say is, it should not be because of your zip code or the luck of the draw that you get to live in a green home that you can afford regardless of your race or income. What we're trying to say is everybody should be able to live in this kind of housing because of these benefits that household will receive, and that you and I collectively will receive because we're also addressing our climate issues. So, it was a fair question, Clayton, but I think that the Green Communities criteria can handle any situation, and that's how they were designed to be, in a way that's iterative and keeps us learning about how to do things better.
Sure. No, thanks. I think we've got time for probably one more. So this is probably the last question here. And I think there's a tendency to end these kinds of discussions with somebody like me asking somebody like you, what gives you hope? And I actually don't love that question, mostly because I think a lot of folks' answers are kind of the same. So I'm not going to ask you that. And instead, I'm going to challenge you to issue your own challenge to the audience here. And in particular, I mean, we've got folks who are interested in climate policy, in affordable housing, in the development and solving of both of these crises. Given what you and your colleagues are working on, what do you need from us to do your work better? What do you need from the audience to ensure that a vision like this comes to fruition?
Yeah, I appreciate that. We're both hopeful, aren't we? So I prefer to answer that question. I would ask that you stop. I would ask that you stop thinking we can't afford to green all our housing in this country, and instead demand that that is the only kind of housing that we are providing in this country, because both of our lives depend on it. Quite frankly, our society depends on it. And we have to, I would ask everybody to stop segregating these issues and to put housing front and center of our discussion around addressing the climate chaos that we're in, because the root cause of both crises are the same. The root cause is that we continue to think that we can extract from people and the planet in ways that we will never be accountable for. And so we have to address those root problems in a way that delivers a much more equitable and green future. So please stop pretending that we don't have a housing and a climate crisis, and demand that we address them together in one fell swoop, from gray to green, as I like to say.
Amen. Well, good. Dana Bourland, thank you so much. I think we're just about out of time. Thank you to Town Hall. Thanks to Grist and to Third Place and Island Press. It's been really lovely to be here and have this conversation with you tonight.
Thank you. Me too.
Yeah, and on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank both of you. Thanks so much for your moderation, Clayton, and Dana. Thanks so much for bringing your research to us and for bringing those issues together. It's like so prescient for Seattle. I mean, you just walk around and you see, a lot of like climate activists and a lot of housing activists, and bringing them together makes a lot of sense to me. So thank you so much for your work. I want to thank the audience as well. Thank you so much for watching and for your questions. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, please use the link in the chat, and that'll take you right over to Third Place. Thank you both again so much. I hope that you stay safe as we get through sort of the latter stages of this pandemic, and hopefully we can see you in person next time. But I hope you have a great evening.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.